You can hit the thing. So good morning. Hope everybody is as warm as they can be this morning. And what I thought we would do a little bit this week is I need this, and some of you guys may also be in the same place. I thought this would be a little bit of a good week to sort of slow down and do a little bit of just almost a recap to sort of see where we are. And we haven't had as much time necessarily to always talk through questions that people may have in their mind over a lot of the material, either that we've covered just in the last few weeks, if we started to focus on more of the modern denominations or just in general. So in the light of full transparency, that also kept me from doing about 4 hours worth of work yesterday to prepare the next two segments of slides. So I thought it was a good thing for us to pause and sort of look back a little bit and open up for questions and discussion. But it also gave me a Saturday of preparation off, so that wasn't a bad thing either. So having said that, I'm just going to open the floor up to the group of us that are here. Does anybody have anything that they've been wanting to ask or wanted to talk about, anything we've covered here of late that we maybe haven't gone to the right depth of? And we'll try to bring that back and get some learnings out of that. Again, either the sign that I've done a perfect job of teaching or I've utterly failed. I'm not sure what that is.
I think you've done a great job.
All right. Thank you. The check's in the mail. It just won't come tomorrow because it's a mail holiday. It's really, really cold outside. Then I guess I'll ask this question. What's been your biggest surprise maybe in the last couple of weeks about something we've talked about? Maybe that I didn't know that, or I didn't realize that, or something like that. What caught you off guard, if anything?
Well, I listened to the R.C. Sproul taping about the credo baptism.
The debate with he and John MacArthur.
Yeah, and the credo about his argument. I mean, I had never heard it presented that way before.
Yeah, there were some things. I think I mentioned this when I suggested that resource. I had the same. First of all, I respect Sproul. I respect both of those men a great deal. And did you listen to both sides of that thing, Sherry?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Because Jeff was a big R.C. Sproul, fan. So, I agree with you. I mean, coming from R.C. Sproul, it made me listen. I guess with a little better open mind, maybe. You
weren't listening to some crackpot. My
right.
Imagination. And again, the thing that I most appreciated about that was I had the same impact. I hadn't really thought about it that way. But then I also, the thing that was fantastic to watch was two believers who respect each other, disagree on something, but respect each other and recognize they're able to do that. We don't see that, as often in the world today as we'd like to see. To me, that was the other uplifting part of that. But I still do strongly recommend it because I think it was well done by both gentlemen. So what surprised you about Sproul's position on credo baptism?
Well, now
I'm sorry, on pedio baptism.
I knew you were. Oh, nothing surprised me on that. It was Sproul's. Wasn't Sproul the
Sproul was defending.
No, Sproul was
defending pedio baptism. He was defending infant baptism.
Yeah. I knew you were. Now I can't believe you're going to ask specifics. I should have written some stuff down. Sorry.
Yeah. For me, go ahead.
I just remember thinking, oh, I never thought of it that way. I've never looked at it that way. I've never,
Yeah. I guess I should have thought about it this way, but the thing that struck me was how it connects to something we haven't really even talked about through this, and we may not even really talk about it because it's a little bit of a offshoot thing. But the question of where you stand on, it goes by a couple of different names theologically, but covenant theology, which is is the church, it's the relationship of the church and the covenant, the new covenant and the old covenant. And, you know, the point there being the connection that was made frequently is an argument that's for infant baptism is connecting it to the concept of the importance that circumcision represented with the old covenant. Because again, when a male Jewish child was circumcised on the 8th day, what choice did they have in that circumcision?
None.
None. And yet God had commanded it. So, you know, what are we supposed to draw from that in terms of what that means? Well, what it was it was symbolic of the fact that they were born into a scenario where that covenant was important. Having said that, the other parallel is that what happens in Jewish culture for that same boy at a later date?
Bar mitzvah.
Bar mitzvah, which in some ways then is also a parallel or an equivalent in my mind to the concept for those denominations that still practice infant baptism and the Catholic Church, as it ties over to the concept of confirmation. You know, this happened to you when you were a child. Do you still adhere to this? And, you know, I guess when I heard that, I'm like, well, of course that makes sense. But I hadn't really heard it expressed as cleanly or as clearly as Sproul did it in that debate. Good. I'm glad you enjoyed that resource. Anybody else have something that was maybe a surprise to them over particularly the last few, as we've talked about, you know, heading down the path of understanding who the Anabaptists were, and, you know, the time we spent talking about the Anglican Church. Can everybody see what I'm sharing now on the screen?
Yes.
I'm going to sort of introduce something here. I don't really have like tons of slides to do that and to work it through, but I'm going to pull the curtain back a little bit and show you one of the challenges of what I've been struggling with in terms of how to walk this through. We've mainly been walking this through by date, because that's the chronological flow makes a lot of sense to me. So again, going back in our study, we talked about how we got to 1054. Obviously 1517 is the obvious date here. And then we picked up on the, yeah, you can see the red a little bit better. The 1054 date leading down to the 1517 date, that's easy. That's Luther, right? And the break off from there. And then we looked at this 1525 break off, which is, you know, the Anabaptist break off. We spent some time looking at that. And then we popped back up because 1525, the next date here is 1534. But then about the same time, we have 1536. And I've had to use this a number of times. And I could have gone a couple of different ways, but the next place we're going to go, because we have to go there, is to go down this path of what's labeled here on this chart anyway, the Calvinist path. And very often when we study the Reformation, we talk about the Reformation, and there are a number of big figures in the Reformation. Certainly Luther is a big figure. Calvin's a big figure. Zwingli, who we talked about a little bit here because he was connected to the discussion about the Anabaptists. And then, of course, what we've been talking about, which is, you know, Henry's role in the English Reformation. But the two big branches of, if you will, mainline Reformation are the Lutheran branch and the Calvinist branch. And where it gets tricky here, and this is what we're going to discover as we roll this out over the next few weeks and talk about particularly this interplay here, this dashed line that connects the top to the bottom here, is we use Calvinist in a very, Calvinist is one of those words that people use in different ways and it means different things. So let's talk a little bit today just to sort of establish a baseline there. And then want to go back and pick up some of the very late part of reviewing the last part of the stuff we've done over the last couple of weeks for the Church of England, the Anglican Church, because it'll tie back into where we pick back up. So first, I'm just going to throw it out there. When I use the word, when I talk about John Calvin, or we talk about Calvinism or Calvinists, what's the kind of stuff that pops into your head? Tulip. So Kathy's thinking flowers, best known out of Holland, right?
Constant. Absolutely. To me, what's the word I'm looking for?
P. You said a P word?
Inability of men, of a man to affect his salvation.
Yeah. The normal place we center around, and tulip is an expression of this, is predestination. And that is an important part of Calvinism and the Calvinist element of the Reformation. So traditionally, as Baptists, are we Calvinists?
Traditionally,
No.
No?
I was going to say we broke off from Calvinism to some extent over this point.
So Kathy's going with a no. I think I heard a no from Sherry. Did I hear a no from you, Doug?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I would agree with your no. If you had said yes, I would also have agreed to some degree with your yes. Because one of the things I think that's important to understand, and this is where the tulip, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tulip concept even here today, because it will lead into it as we get to other places. The acronym TULIP is a shorthand for sort of 5 categories that are inside of the concept of predestination. And like Doug correctly said, it's about what role we play in salvation versus the role that God plays in salvation. It's the interplay in your view of salvation and what it means to be predestined, or what it means, more importantly, the correct theological term that's often used there is, are you one of the elect? Which are those that have been chosen to have been saved, or been chosen to have the possibility of being saved, again, depending on where your view is. The point that I want you to grasp, this is a real important thing to have a hold on as we move through this, is that Calvinism is not, and the positions on predestination are not necessarily binary. It's not either a 1 or a 0, which is why you will sometimes hear the term TULIP. Just to cover it really quickly, I don't even know if I have a slide for it. The T stands for total depravity. The U stands for unconditional election. The L stands for limited atonement. The I stands for irresistible grace, and P stands for perseverance of the believer. We sometimes talk about people being a quote unquote 5-point Calvinist. So if you are a 5-point Calvinist, what does that even suggest is the possibility?
That you might be a 4-point Calvinist, a 3-point Calvinist, a 2-point Calvinist, or a 1-point.
Yeah. So again, the idea of, that there's this, you're either a Calvinist or you're not. You're a 1 or a 0 is a misleading concept. Also, those 5 points, which are sort of used, Kathy said tulip. We all know tulip. If you'd walked up to, I don't know, one of Calvinist followers a generation later and asked them, what do you think about tulip? They said, well, it's a lovely flower, and I lost a lot of money in that speculative craze that went on in the Netherlands about them. Because there was no understanding of that. In fact, those 5 points of Calvinism were actually defined not by Calvinists.
Hey, how you doing?
They were defined by Arminianists who were standing in opposition to some degree to Calvin. So even understanding when we talk about the 5 points of being a 5-point Calvinist, that was not even defined by those who hold to, that was not even defined by those who are 5-point Calvinists. That was actually a framework by those who opposed them that then became the area over which they discussed. That makes sense?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. What is the no part there?
Yeah, well, it's a little hard for me to understand how a concept that has a person's name, that person would not have recognized or would not
Yeah.
have
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
advocated.
How that the better way I think to describe it is that the way we express it in a modern sense is different than those who were actually living it during the time. This is a poor analogy, but someone who died in France in 1917 during that great conflict didn't think of themselves as dying in World War I.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah,
They called it the Great War.
right.
And
They hadn't learned to number them yet.
right, because they didn't know what was yet to come.
Right.
And so while their experience would be the same, the way that if you use that term today, again, maybe it's not the best analogy, but it's the first one that popped in my head. If you talk to some limited number of folks today about what happened during the Great War, some of them are going to be a little bit fuzzy about what war you're talking about, because there's been subsequent big wars. If you said World War I, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about. And the same is true of the, for example, what we define as Calvinism today, or 5-point Calvinist using Tulip, or Arminianism. Those that were in the middle of it didn't necessarily identify themselves that way. Jacob Arminius, who is sort of considered to be the poster child for that view, how we get the term Arminius, there were not people running around that day saying, I'm not a Calvinist, I'm an Arminius. They were just, this is my position on predestination. So does that make sense? Did that help?
Yes, I was going to say Calvinist has almost been a 4-letter word.
Yes, that's exactly. I'm glad you recognize that, because that's exactly where I'm going. It has become, for better or worse, a pejorative almost in many instances. And I
was in a church a number of years ago where we actually removed a pastor because he was accused of being a Calvinist.
And like we've talked about before, where does even heresies, and I am not suggesting at all that Calvinism is a heresy, because I think it still falls within much of the mainline theological construct to be called orthodox, no doubt about that. But where do most, as we talked about before, where do most even good heresies come from? They come from Scripture.
From Orthodox beliefs. Yes. Yeah.
They come from some reading of Scripture. It may be a wrong reading of Scripture, but it comes from some basis in Scripture. And particularly when you get into the discussion about, again, using the modern terms that we use, Calvinist versus Arminian thought, the thing to realize is that there are strong scriptural arguments on both sides of every single one of those letters represented by the acronym or the acrostic.
Yes.
You can point to not just one, but multiple scriptures that would be an advocate for, and to the extent that some of those concepts lie in opposition to something else, an advocate against that position. So I really just want to, this is why I skipped over going down the Calvinist path until we got a little bit further into this. I wanted to make sure that we had well established the background to be able to deal with, again, Doug, I appreciate you saying it, recognizing that that has become something of a four-letter theological word in a lot of circles. And if we're not careful, we will read back into the history of the early 16th century our understanding of that word and not even what they understood or thought at the time, if that makes sense. Any more thoughts or questions about that particular point? So now I have a question that relates to that because it would be a little bit of a derailing. Do we have a need at some point here soon to actually go through, there's probably no other better way to do it, even though what I've described already, to go through the elements of TULIP, to go through both sides of that. Is that something that we feel we already have a pretty good grasp on, or is that something we feel like we need to do?
Didn't we already do it pretty thoroughly rather recently?
We did it a couple of years back. That's why I asked the question. I don't want to replow ground that's already plowed, but I also don't want to make a bad assumption.
What was that,
Well,
Don? What was that, Don? What were you asking about?
Do we need to go back through here at some point, because it will be helpful, an understanding of the two sides of the predestination argument, if you will, going through. The best way I know to do it is to go through TULIP and talk about both sides and look at the verses and look at both viewpoints. Do we need to do that, or is that something we have a firm enough grasp on that that's be nice, but it's a derailment of time?
I think a short refresher might be helpful.
Okay, but
Yeah,
not a full-blown couple of weeks on it, right, at all?
No, no.
Okay.
Right.
And that was my challenge, because we're about to the point, we'll get to the point here where we need to do that, or at least reintroduce that. Didn't want anybody to be wandering around in the TULIP desert while we were doing it. And also understanding again that we bring, well, Doug's already identified, we bring a modern viewpoint to this, depending upon how we were raised and instructed, where the word can even mean something that it really didn't mean back then because it didn't exist back then. Or the other thing we'll bring to the table, which is where I wanted to go here, is that we're not careful, we'll get so focused on the predestination question with respect to Calvin that we will sort of get fixated on that and not the other elements of what Calvin was bringing to the Reformation, because there were other parts of what was going on, of what Calvin was bringing to the Reformation that were separate from his views on predestination. Does that make sense? There's more to Calvin than predestination is the point. There's a lot more to Calvin than predestination. So I don't want to, the other thing I'm worried about is getting too fixated on that, which is a major part of what he brings to the Reformation and to the discussion, but it's certainly not the only part.
I guess what I would like to hear discussed is, I've been listening to Bruce Gore, and
for all disclosure, where will Bruce fall in terms of Calvinist versus Arminianist?
Closer to Calvinist.
He's definitely going to be there because he's here. He's a Presbyterian.
Yeah. But his description of Calvin, I didn't hear predestination mentioned at all in his description of Calvin's life and ministry. And that was what really shocked me, surprised.
Yeah, and actually the other thing we'll talk about as we go down this, this particular branch here, sort of using this again as our framework that we're hanging things off of, it became more of an issue after Calvin was dead than it was while Calvin was alive. For example, the Council of Dort, which is where the issue gets discussed, this is in the Netherlands much later, is post-Calvin. And so, again, predestination was one of the things that Calvin wrote about, but it was not something that was even the major emphasis in terms of during Calvin's life, necessarily what he thought about that he was bringing that was so incredibly revolutionary to the theological discussion. Later, it became a point of contention and a major point of contention. And it is important to note that it does actually, this dotted line becomes really important here in the sense that it becomes something that influences back to the Anglican Church, and then the things that will flow off of that as well as where you stand on that. And again, you mentioned the Bruce Gore stuff there. You've heard me say this before. If I could sit in any Sunday school class that I'm familiar with anywhere in the world next Sunday, I think I would choose his class, whatever he's teaching on. But, that's just me because I'm compelled by the way that he teaches, even though I do know that theologically, he and I probably have some things we disagree on, maybe even some big things. But I do commend a lot of his stuff, particularly on the history of the church. I draw from it in a lot of my preparation, particularly on the history of particularly the medieval moving into the modern church. That series that he has, and there's a link to that on our Sunday school website. I do commend that. I also highly commend the stuff with Gordon Cornwell Seminary, the Ryan Reeves stuff that I've linked there. There's some other really good stuff there that'll get you there. Anything else we need to talk about just on that broad? I now know what to do next. I'll do like a 15 or 20 minute, or try to contain it to that quick overview, and making sure that I also produce some materials that everybody can have in hand that show the scriptures that support both sides of the TULIP acronym, because you really want to see where is this coming from scripture.
The heater in the bathroom
All right.
wasn't working.
Any questions about our view through English history, the formation of the Anglican Church, Henry to Edward to Mary to Elizabeth? Anything that's still lingering there that was a question last week that we need to go through? That's probably a good slide to have up there.
Okay. This isn't really a question. It's an observation. I would have to say my view beforehand of the English Reformation had been that it was more political than theological, and everything I've learned both from listening to you and listening to Bruce Gore has just confirmed that.
I agree with that, Doug, because that's the way I was always sort of taught about it and the way that I think about it because of how it started. I think when we haven't quite reached this yet, I think the real point, the real expression of the English Reformation that is different from being political falls after this series of monarchs.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and just so everybody sort of has a clear thing, again, this was also part of the challenge about how you come at this, how do you attack it, is another one of the reasons that this sort of dotted line exists here is eventually Calvinist thought is going to become very predominant in the Protestant thought in Scotland because of this character by the name of John Knox, who basically brings a lot of this to Scotland. And so with the relationship that exists between England and Scotland, and then ultimately what really happens is, remember, there eventually comes an end to the Tudor line. That's sort of why I went through Elizabeth there as the stopping point, because the Tudors are no longer, because then we shift over to the Stuarts. And the reason we shift over to the Stuarts is because Elizabeth dies without an heir. And so James VI of Scotland retains his title as James VI of Scotland, but he also becomes James I of England. And a lot has already happened in Scotland regarding the Reformation, the Scottish Reformation, which we haven't even talked about yet, because it's better to talk about that in terms of when we talk about Calvinism and what goes there. In fact, the Presbyterian Church, the way that we think of it now, draws greatly out of a Scottish origin. And there's an influence down on James that comes from that. And then subsequent to that, during the period of the Glorious Revolution and some of the other things that happen is where we will talk about what I think really is more the true English Reformation, because that's what starts leading us into things like the Congregationalists, the Separatists, those people that we know from American history as the Pilgrims, for example, show up as a result of that. And that is far more theologically reformed than politically reformed. Would you agree with that, Doug?
Yes, I would.
Yeah. It takes longer. The English Reformation is sort of on slow burn, is the other way that I think about it. It's got a long fuse compared to the continental Reformation, Luther and Calvin. That all happens very quickly in the span of about 20 or 30 years, that there's boom, there's the explosion, and a lot of stuff happens. Whereas the English Reformation, as we even saw by how it evolves back and forth, and initially is more political than theological. Some theology gets mixed in with it. There's a reversal on the theology. Then there's back to Elizabeth. That again, that evolves from 1534, which is the Act of Supremacy under Henry, over the next 70 years to get to the end of Elizabeth's reign, with the back and forth that goes on in between here. As modern Baptists, we haven't really covered this yet, but I'm just going to throw this out there as a concept. Which, we have to pop back and forth. It's good to do so. You're going to see that, at least on the chart that we're using, I'm showing us, and we'll discuss a heritage that draws out more of coming out of Congregationalism, coming out of essentially the English version of Calvinism that takes hold more in the early 17th century. It's real important for us to realize our English heritage roots as Baptists, while at the same time recognizing that and again, Calvin was French. Our French Swiss origins here, which are also down here as well. Any other questions or comments about the Anglican part here?
I wish Mickey were here.
You think you'd have a question?
Yeah, he probably would have 3 or 4.
Yeah, or at least a comment. I believe that. I wish you were here too. The other thing I'll just note is that we're not done with this branch. We're gonna pause and come down and then come back to it, because obviously it has other things that happen down the road. So we've sort of covered probably the first of 3 parts of the evolution of the Protestant church, more centered in what we now know as the United Kingdom, in England and then Scotland. So we'll be coming back to it in 2 ways. The next phase, as I talked about, is sort of the period of James and into the Glorious Revolution and the upheaval that happens there, into the rise of Congregationalism and the things that happen there. And then the last place we'll go to is this 1738, when we have the break off of Methodism, the Wesleys, from the Anglican Church.
Don, are you going to ever talk about the breakoffs from the Lutheran Church, like the Evangelical Covenant and the Evangelical Free?
Yeah, and we're going to come back. I think the sequence is going to be popping down here to pick up a lot of the Calvinist stuff, followed by the Lutheran stuff, because both of those are important then to set the stage for when we get to this break right here, that 1607 break. But modern Lutheranism, modern being 19th century moving forward, is an interesting thing.
Can I tell you, Jeff and I attended, before we came to Sterlingwood, we were a member of an Evangelical Covenant church for 10 years.
Okay. So you'll be able to shed some insight there that I don't have from personal experience. I've mentioned a coworker of mine who she and I talk things religious every once in a while. She's a Lutheran, and I was specifically asking her about her churches, because there's really like 4 large Lutheran groupings today, as I understand it. And there are theological disagreements among, not all Lutherans line up under the same camp today the way they did at one point in the past. And you see the two distinctions there, the free versus covenant. We will spend some time talking about that. And the other thing to realize is that Lutheranism is very much tied to us geographically. And everybody understands why, right? Texas has a lot of German immigrants that came here. Much of Texas is heavily influenced by those of German extract who came here, particularly in during the period of time when Texas was being settled outside of those that were settling from Mexico. And so that's the reason we have towns like Schulenburg and Fredericksburg and lots of burgs there in Central Texas is because of the German. That's the reason we have, good barbecue and other stuff as well that came out of that tradition as well. But there actually is a fairly large Lutheran presence in Texas because of that, because of the tie back to Germany. Eisenhower was born in Texas. Eisenhower is a very solid German name.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Two other things I was going to cover then based upon what was there. I really want to hit upon the last bit of Anglican history. I thought it was good to let us take a breath and catch up a little bit because we've been running pretty hard with the history. Is that understanding I think we started touching on this the end part of last week is Elizabeth's reign has a lot of attributes that help set up what happens after this. First of all, is Elizabeth's reign short or long?
Short.
Long.
Long.
Very long.
Mary's was short. Edward's before that was short. So, to me, one of the most interesting what ifs of history is to imagine if there'd been another short Elizabethan reign, again, her dying with no heir, and what could have happened in terms of having another whipsaw effect in English history. But the fact that she reigns for such a long period of time, the important thing to realize there is by the time we pick a lot of this story back up and some of the evolution here, we talked about this a lot last week. Remember, under Mary, it goes, Henry, it's one thing. Edward, it lurches further into Protestantism. Mary comes and it lurches back towards Catholicism. There's that back and forth over a 10 to 11 year span there that, as we talked about, going to church on Sunday or being an English citizen was a whiplash effect. Elizabeth's reign being so long creates something that's very important that will allow other things to build, which is stability. And I think, more than anything else, if you draw from understanding sort of this flow of the timeline of the English Reformation that we sort of see here, is that 1558 to 1603 is a long time. And so what happens is there's stability that gets brought, which gets us away from the period from 1547 to 1558, where we had Edward and Mary going back and forth. So that stability is an important part. The other key element during Elizabeth's reign is the fact that she brought more of a middle course. She charted more of a middle course. Part of this is very much back to your comment, Doug. This is all still politics, right? It's religion, but it's still politics. Partly because she wanted to chart more of a middle political course, and that meant charting more of a middle theological course, given what had happened. So the Elizabethan settlement was more moderate than what had prevailed under Edward. It was certainly more moderate than what had prevailed under Mary. This is coming back to a middle course. So a lot is going to happen historically and politically during Elizabeth's reign and how they are interacting with the rest of Europe. See any number of great movies that have been made. I think half of them star Cate Blanchett who plays Elizabeth in multiple movies. But there's a lot that is going on historically with during Elizabeth's reign with the continental powers in Europe. But internally inside of England, there is dissension, there is disagreement, there's still tension between the various branches of Christianity, but it's not like it was during the period of Edward and during the period of Mary. So Elizabeth is also presenting a unified English front to the rest of Europe when it comes to what's going on inside of her own country. And it was, so there was a new act of supremacy. She is still considered to be the head of the church, but now she's just known as the supreme governor. Public officials were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the queen as supreme governor, but they were basically, if they were a public official, they were providing an oath to her as monarch, not to her as monarch and head of the church in quite the same way because of the supreme governor change. Heresy laws, for the most part, were repealed to avoid the persecution of dissenters. So it was still heresy. You could still be outside the official teachings of the church, but it wasn't the same level, particularly in the latter part of Elizabeth's reign, of executions and tortures and the other things that went on. And again, the 1559 version of the Book of Common Prayer was the compulsory one, and church attendance was made compulsory. This still is a very much, you go to church because you are required by the crown to go to church or else you're disloyal. But again, the penalties for disobedience were greatly reduced. They were much more mild. So in one way you might think of Protestantism under Elizabeth is it's a kinder, gentler form of Protestantism that's brought into play. The other thing that I wanted to talk about here, again, ties back to the very thing we talked about, why Henry's break, aside from wanting it for the purposes of getting a divorce or an annulment, is important, is this idea of the relationship between church and state. So when I tell you, for example, that church attendance was required by the state, does that surprise you?
Yeah.
No.
It surprises Kathy, so I'm gonna let her answer first, Doug, and I'm gonna let you
Okay.
give your no. So why the yes?
Again, it's a very me now versus me having grown up then. Now to say that the government can tell me what I have to do on a Sunday morning seems crazy. I mean, back in the day, I can see that, but like, again, I'm not a good student of history, and I guess I never really thought that it was required. It was probably expected. It was I can use other words, but I wouldn't have said
Compulsory. You wouldn't use the word compulsory.
Right. I wouldn't. Are people really going to show up at your house on Sunday morning and like arrest you because you're not in church? Apparently that happened.
Sort of the ultimate bus ministry.
Again, it's a very modern,
So Doug, your no?
Yeah, well, I understand that politics and religion were completely mixed. That is, that the church and the state were both intermixed as the source of power, and because it was a more personal power, it was actually in the monarch, and so that power had to come from being able to control everything that people did. I really doubt that they went around house to house and rounded up people and made them go to the local attend church. But again, that was another thing that gave the monarch another charge to bring against someone that they wanted to bring back into control was that they had not been attending church. So it just was another form of power that the monarch had. And I'd have to say, in the United States, a few months ago, there were certain places where your attendance at church was prohibited by the government. So
Yeah, and in fact, the Supreme Court ruled on that, I guess, within the last week about the California restrictions that were there. And trying to, then they're trying to balance something, a unique situation with the pandemic, and what does that mean? But this whole idea of the contest, and contest maybe is not even the word that I want to use, but the tension that has existed for a long time between church and state is still something that reverberates all the way down to today.
Was it Huss that kind of was the first one to? I don't remember that it wasn't Luther, but it was in the same time period. One of the first reformers who actually came out and said that the state was not given authority in religious realm.
It was there, and it was also very much when we talked about the Anabaptist movement, because they were primarily in Switzerland, and they're the local. For example, if you remember the little video that we watched, the local city council had decreed that all the infants had to be baptized, and that's when they stood up and said, the one guy who had a newborn said, "No, I'm not doing that," and so Huss did to a degree. Also, that was something that happened with Wycliffe, who was on the was about the same time as Huss in the English in England. But again, thinking back all the way through it, I mean, this ties back to the things that we talked about with Constantine. It certainly expresses forward, the connection between church and state with Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor. Even the question about, even the 1054 schism is over, relates to a little bit of who gets to declare because remember, the Holy Roman Emperor was still sort of over both sides of the empire, even though one side of the empire had fully collapsed and really turned into the church. And it manifests itself later. We were talking about, the question of the investiture controversy, who gets to choose who the religious official is. It shows up in 1215 and in the Magna Carta between the nobles and King John about who has the authority here. And part of what's difficult, what I think Kathy's view expresses this, because we all have this, is we've been blessed to live in a country where one of its founding principles in its revolution was this idea of the church being autonomous from the state. So for the benefits of it and the detriments of it, we live in a country where there is religious liberty and religious freedom, where these two things are not intertwined, except to the extent that they are, because it still comes up. But, even in early colonial America, in the colonies before post-revolution, it was not uncommon in some of the colonies for membership in a particular church to be a requirement to vote or to hold office. That was still very much common, particularly in some of the colonies that had been founded because of religious persecution, ironically, because of religious persecution, and had fled to the United States. There were requirements that you be a member in good standing of the right colonial church in order to hold office. And so that tradition exists, even on our continent. That tradition exists. And thinking back to ultimately what becomes the settlement with Luther's Reformation, is eventually they come to this agreement. The Peace of Augsburg is that basically who gets to choose whether a region is Protestant or Catholic?
The political power, the electors, I think, was in that. Is that right?
Well, to a degree, the ultimate conclusion, whoever reigns, it's whoever reigns, it's his religion. And so There, even this is Reformation. This is post-Reformation, was the concept of, if your local prince or your local king is a Protestant, he has the right to say we're Protestants. If he's Catholic or she's Catholic, they have the right to say we're Catholic. And we saw that even expressed in Henry's institution of the Reformation by saying that he's the head of the church. Yes, it took the Pope out of that role, but replaced the Pope with who? Him. Because again, how is he made king? What is his right to kingship?
The divine right.
It's a divine right. So they recognized a relationship between monarchy, politics, and religion that we can, I think for me, I'll just speak for me personally, but maybe it's true for each of you as well. I recognize that intellectually, but I have a very difficult time rationalizing that emotionally because I haven't lived really in that, having to deal with that quite the same way. Again, to Kathy's point, there's nobody showing up at the door saying, "Why aren't you in church this morning?"
And John Knox, I guess, coming up, he will be another figure who very strongly argues for the separation of the political and religious. It's hard. It's hard for me. I can understand. I'm like you. I can understand it intellectually. I can understand it as an idea, but it's hard for me to actually believe that a realistic fact in my life that the ruler had some kind of divine right.
But again, that's what's so radical to some degree about the Declaration of Independence and then subsequently the Constitution, when what it says there is, that the people are ordained with essentially the divine right to throw off an unjust government. That doesn't sound so radical to us today.
But it was
very radical then. And the reason I bring it up in the context of what we're doing here is understanding the role, for example, particularly of Congregationalists that were separatists. Baptist tradition flows out of this. They were challenging the theological power of the church here in the early 17th century in a way that we've inherited that tradition. And understanding that becomes a big part of understanding how all of this ties together. And that's why it's also important to keep that in mind. And also why, when I mentioned when we first started talking about the 1534 break, it's not relevant just because Henry wants a divorce because of the circumstances that have led up to that. It's relevant because it changes something of the relationship between church and state, but it doesn't change it as far as eventually it will be changed. All right. Any other burning questions? So here's where we will pick up next week. Is we will. I don't know why we're moving
Where did the Berean beliefs come in?
I don't know the answer to that question fully, Bill. When you say Berean, are you talking about in the broad sense or the more narrow sort of denominational theological sense that's used today?
I'm not sure because I've seen it attached with Baptists and I've seen it attached to Seventh-day Adventists, so I'm not really sure.
Yeah, and Seventh-day Adventists flow out of more of the traditional Baptist tradition. They're one of the offshoots of what I would call broad Baptist thought. Trying to think who else is in that split. There's another major group, not Seventh-day Adventist, but something else that's also in that that's an offshoot there.
I don't even know if I've heard of Berean. Where have you seen Berean, Bill? You're muted. They're all gone.
They're all gone.
I've heard of Berean, but I can't tell you anything about it. I mean, some of the people that came to the Evangelical Covenant Church with us were from the Berean Church, so I don't know anything about them.
I don't know anything about them.
Yeah, I think there are a few churches in Texas. I don't know if it came from like German or Czech descent.
So the fairest thing that I can do on that is tell you that I'll look into it. I'm looking here on a different chart now to figure out who the other group that I'm thinking about is. Seventh-day Adventists, Church of God in Christ can be argued probably to come off of the broad Baptist line. But probably the most notable one in a modern sense is Seventh-day Adventists that are still out there.
There used to be a Berean congregation in like the Humboldt Deerbrook area.
Okay. I'll add that to my list. So where we'll go next week when we pick back up and move forward is we're going to put on pause going down the Anglican path a little bit because it's healthy to come back to it because of this being the timing here for when we see James. And we're going to go down the more traditional Calvinist path to establish a baseline for that. And then we'll cover Lutheranism sort of at the same time because they're going to be the basis for understanding the influence that comes back up here into the Anglican Church, which really is this influence down here that we see. They could just have easily, but it didn't work as well for balancing this chart. You could just as easily draw this line here that's leading into this, drawing down from there to a great degree, breaking off of the Anglican Church in 1607. That's why they produced this dotted line here, for the understanding that there is a connection here and that it breaks off from the Calvinist thought that had come into England. So that's where we'll pick up next week, is really looking at who Calvin was, understanding what that is, and moving forward, because that'll be the basis for getting us to Congregationalism, Baptists, and also helping to understand who Presbyterians are, because they flow out of the Scottish Reformation, which is heavily tied to Calvin. John Knox is a name you're going to hear a lot because he's a very influential person in that. All right. I'm going to stop the recording, guys.